The roads of Europe in May 1945 were choked with dust, steel, and absolute fear. Among the millions of grey Wehrmacht uniforms trudging into captivity, there were men who frantically tried to tear the insignia off their collars. They ditched their identity papers in roadside ditches. They rubbed dirt and grease into the runic symbols on their helmets. They were the Waffen SS, Hitler's so-called elite. Just weeks earlier, they had been the poster boys of the Third Reich, fearless, fanatical, and armed with the best tanks German industry could produce. Now they were the most hunted men on the continent. As the Allied armies closed the net, a terrifying reality settled over these men. The war wasn't just lost. For them, the protection of the state had evaporated. American and Soviet commanders weren't looking for soldiers to surrender. They were looking for criminals to hang. But here is the mystery that haunts historians to this day. How did an organization of nearly 1 million men, branded as a criminal enterprise by the entire world, manage to not only survive but, in less than a decade, walk back into the halls of power in Western Germany? They didn't all vanish into the jungles of South America. Most of them were hiding in plain sight. And their greatest battle wasn't fought with tigers and panthers in 1945, but with lawyers and lobbyists in the 1950s. But before they could rewrite history, they first had to survive the reckoning, like stories like this. Drop a comment below. The reckoning began in the courtroom at Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal did something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They didn't just put men on trial, they put the organization itself in the dock. On September 30, 1946, the gavel came down. The SS was declared a criminal organization. This meant that simply wearing the black uniform or the field grey of the Waffen SS could be enough to send a man to prison. It created a legal nightmare. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of veterans were stripped of their rights. They were barred from holding public office, denied pensions, and excluded from the rapidly rebuilding society. To the average German citizen in 1947, the SS man wasn't a hero. He was a liability, a reminder of the catastrophe that had flattened their cities. But how do you identify a man who has burned his uniform? The Allies had a trick, the blood group tattoo. Most SS men had their blood type tattooed on the underside of their left arm. American guards at checkpoints would simply ask German men to roll up their sleeves. No tattoo meant you were likely regular army. A small ink mark, that was the mark of Cain. Yet the system was overwhelmed. The Allies had millions of prisoners and only a handful of judges. The denazification courts became a revolving door. While high-profile commanders like Kurt Meyer were sentenced to death or life imprisonment for atrocities, the rank and file slipped through the cracks. If the world wanted justice, why did it seem to lose interest so quickly? While the foot soldiers tried to blend into the ruins of Hamburg and Munich, the officers were looking for an exit strategy. This is where history begins to bleed into myth. You've likely heard of Odessa, the secret organization of former SS members portrayed in movies and thrillers. The reality was less cinematic, but perhaps more disturbing. There was no single, omnipotent spiderweb. Instead, there were rat lines, loose networks of sympathetic clergy, corrupt officials, and intelligence agents who facilitated the escape of the worst offenders. Let's look closer at how this actually worked. It wasn't just anonymous soldiers slipping away. Take the case of Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka. He didn't crawl through a sewer. He walked out of an Austrian prison, was handed a Red Cross passport in Rome by a sympathetic bishop, and sailed comfortably to Brazil. For years, these men lived parallel lives. In Argentina, they met in German clubs, drank German beer, and toasted to the old days, safe under the protection of the Perón regime. They truly believed they had outsmarted history, but they forgot one thing: the relentless memory of their victims. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 by Mossad agents wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a signal. The world had not forgotten. And suddenly, the coffee in Buenos Aires didn't taste so sweet anymore. However, escaping to South America was the exception, not the rule. Most stayed in Europe and they found an unlikely savior, the Cold War. By 1948, the hunt was slowing down. The Cold War was freezing over Europe. The Americans and British began to look at these battle-hardened veterans not as monsters, but as potential assets against the Soviet Union. Intelligence agencies quietly recruited former SS officers. The Gehlen organization, which would later become the West German Foreign Intelligence Service, was packed with men who had served the Reich. The moral compass of the West was shifting. If the enemy of my enemy is my friend, what happens when your new friend is a war criminal? By 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was born. The rubble was being cleared and the economic miracle was just beginning. But the new Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, had a massive problem. West Germany was a democracy, and democracies need votes. There were hundreds of thousands of former Waffen SS soldiers, along with their families, living in the country. They were organized, they were angry, and they felt betrayed by the state. They were a political time bomb. Adenauer, a pragmatic conservative, made a calculation. He couldn't afford to alienate such a large block of the population. The integration of these men became a priority over justice. In 1953, Adenauer stood up and delivered a sentence that signaled the end of the purge. He declared that the men of the Waffen SS had fought as soldiers, just like others. It was a lie, but it was a necessary lie for the stability of the new state. With those words, the stigma was officially washed away. Pensions were restored. The butchers of the Eastern Front were now your mailmen, your police officers, and your neighbors. Enjoying this deep dive? Tap subscribe so you don't miss what's next. With their pensions secured, the veterans didn't just retire quietly, they organized. In 1951, former high-ranking generals founded Hayek. On paper, it was a welfare organization helping comrades find jobs. In reality, it was a propaganda machine. Hayek had one goal: to separate the Waffen SS from the Holocaust. They crafted the myth of the soldiers like any other. They argued that they were simply elite combat troops who had nothing to do with the concentration camps or the death squads. This was a masterpiece of manipulation. They published glossy magazines and memoirs that focused purely on tank battles and military bravery. Books by generals like Paul Hauser and Kurt Meyer flooded the shelves, portraying the SS as the defenders of Europe against Bolshevism, and the world bought it. During the Cold War, military enthusiasts in Britain and America began to idolize the tactical prowess of the SS. The black uniforms became symbols of military elite status, divorced from the ideology of genocide. Chayag rallies in the 1960s were attended by thousands, with local politicians giving speeches. It seemed they had won. They had successfully buried their crimes under a mountain of battle maps and iron crosses. But history has a way of resurfacing, especially when a new generation starts digging. Before the protests in the streets, there was a courtroom in Frankfurt that changed everything. In 1963, for the first time, German judges tried German criminals under German law for the crimes at Auschwitz. Before this trial, many Germans claimed they didn't know what happened in the East. They hid behind the idea that only a few madmen were responsible. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials destroyed that excuse. Day after day, survivors took the stand. They didn't point at monsters, they pointed at respectable businessmen. They looked into the faces of shopkeepers, dentists and bankers and identified them as the sadistic guards of the camps. The shockwave was immense. These weren't fugitives hiding in the jungle. These were men living next door. The ordinary soldier myth that Hayek had built so carefully began to crack under the weight of forensic evidence. It was no longer about defending Europe, it was about murder. For the first time, the West German public had to confront the reality. that the man sitting next to them on the bus might have been a mass murderer. The silence of the 1950s was shattered. Following the trials, the social dam broke. By the late 1960s, a new generation of Germans was coming of age. These were the children who asked their fathers, "What did you do in the war?" and weren't satisfied with the silence. The student movements of 1968 shattered the polite consensus of the Adenauer era. They didn't care about stability, they wanted truth. Journalists began to expose the deep connections between Hayek and neo-Nazi groups. Historians joined the fight. The opening of archives revealed the undeniable truth that the Waffen SS was integral to the Holocaust. They weren't just soldiers, they were the primary enforcers of the racial war. They had staffed the camps, hunted partisans, and liquidated ghettos. The myth of the clean Waffen SS crumbled. Public opinion turned. The reunions that used to draw crowds were now met with protesters shouting, "Nazi raus!" The government, which had once courted these veterans for votes, now distanced itself. By the 1980s, Hayek was fighting a losing battle. The organization that had once commanded the attention of chancellors was now a pariah. They dissolved federally in 1992, bitter and resentful, claiming they were the victims of a witch hunt. But as the veterans died off, did their dangerous ideas die with them? Today, the physical men of the Waffen SS are almost all gone, but their ghosts are louder than ever. In the vacuum left by the Soviet Union's collapse, a strange phenomenon emerged in Eastern Europe. In countries like Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine, local SS units are sometimes commemorated not as Nazis, but as freedom fighters who battled against Soviet occupation. Every year in Riga, there is a march honoring the Latvian Legion. To the marchers, it is a celebration of national independence. To the rest of the world, it looks like the glorification of the Third Reich. It is a diplomatic nightmare that proves how messy history really is. Meanwhile, on the internet, the myth created by Hayek lives on. Discussion boards and video games often fetishize the equipment and style of the SS, stripping away the context of their crimes. The clean Wehrmacht myth has migrated from German beer halls to digital chat rooms. Germany itself has taken a hard line. Under Section 86A of the Criminal Code, displaying SS runes is illegal. The state has made its choice. There is no honor in that uniform. But legislation cannot police thought. The struggle over how to remember these men is no longer about pensions or trials. It is about the soul of Europe. When we look back at the fate of the Waffen SS, we see a disturbing reflection of our own desire for closure. In 1945, the world wanted justice, but by 1950, the world wanted normality. It was easier to reintegrate these men than to prosecute 1 million soldiers. It was easier to accept the lie that they were just soldiers than to confront the reality that ordinary men can become willing executioners. The survival of the Waffen SS veterans wasn't a grand conspiracy. It was a failure of collective memory. They rebuilt their lives because society let them. They rewrote their history because we listened. 80 years later, the lesson is clear. Evil does not vanish when a treaty is signed. It hides, it adapts, and it waits for us to look away. The soldiers are gone, but the war for history, that is never over.